Alchemy is the precursor to chemistry, and yet it is strongly associated with Hermeticism and other subjects that are usually classified as being occult. And this is because there were multiple exoteric and multiple esoteric understandings of what alchemy was really all about. Exoteric meaning that which is obvious, that which is on the surface, and esoteric meaning that which is hidden or that which is secret. But at its most basic, alchemy was the precursor to chemistry, and that's precisely how it's presented in most modern day fiction, especially video games. And I think the most popular example of this from recent years comes from the Witcher series of video games, especially The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, in which the protagonist Geralt routinely uses alchemy to concoct potions to give him some advantage or other, and routinely uses it to craft bombs that he can use both offensively and defensively. Now, I didn't want to record footage of The Witcher 3 for this video because it would have resulted in a massive file size, so instead I recorded footage of an older alchemist protagonist, namely Shakan, the Forever Man, who I believe originated in comic books, but the story behind Shakan is that he challenged death to a duel in the hopes of achieving immortality once he'd defeated death. And he actually did defeat death, and he did achieve immortality, but of course there was a twist to it. Once Shakan had defeated death in a duel, he was condemned to walk the earth until he had destroyed all supernatural evil. And so he got what he wanted, but there was a twist, and the blessing that he sought became a curse. And I think that Shakan is probably a better alchemist to use for the background of this video than Geralt, purely because of his hat, and purely because of his dress and his style, because Shakan's look is the stereotypical look that alchemists are held to have had, especially throughout so much fiction in the modern day. But when it comes to alchemy as a precursor to chemistry, alchemists are most strongly associated with transmutation, with the attempt to change one or more base material substances, into another material substance. And yet, even in those cases where you have alchemists who are explicitly focused on working with material substances, there was almost always a spiritual component to their approach, simply because alchemy, it comes down to us from the ancient world, it comes to us from the Middle Ages, and throughout history, of course, most human beings have had an inherently spiritual worldview, and they naturally brought that worldview into any activities that they engaged in, including alchemy. And you see this throughout the ancient world. Ancient peoples had a certain understanding about how the universe worked and about how the human body, for example, worked. There was a very common understanding that the human body was made up of certain elements, and for a human being to function aright, those elements had to be kept in balance. And so there was this idea that if a human being was ill or otherwise dysfunctional, it was because of an imbalance of those elements. And so medical science was predicated on that idea for a very long time, and the approach that individuals took when engaging in medical science was informed by these kind of notions that would not stand up in the modern day as far as modern science is concerned. But there tended to be some kind of spiritual component to all of these approaches, simply because the people that engaged in those approaches themselves had an inherently spiritual worldview. And it may be the case that some alchemical works, whether they come to us from the ancient world or whether they come to us from the Middle Ages, they may be entirely metaphorical. And while it may seem that they are speaking about material substances exclusively, they may actually be about spiritual truth. And this is why I thought it was worth making a video on this subject on this channel and in my Monday Mysticism playlist. Now, another concept that's strongly associated with alchemy is that of the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone, in short, is held to be the ultimate accomplishment within alchemy. It is held to be the goal that any given alchemist was pursuing, but because there are multiple exoteric and esoteric understandings of what alchemy was really about, what the Philosopher's Stone was understood to be would naturally differ from alchemist to alchemist. So to some, the Philosopher's Stone was the secret to eternal life, the secret to physical eternal life, or some other form of what we would call in the modern day transhumanism. But I think that most people associate the Philosopher's Stone as being the secret through which an alchemist might turn base metals into gold. And there were certainly many alchemists historically who pursued that and took it very, very seriously. But in those cases where it seems that an alchemist or some alchemical manuscript is actually referring to spiritual truth, then the alchemist would surely have understood the Philosopher's Stone to be the secret to some kind of a spiritual transcendence, and that's why, again, it could potentially be of relevance to spiritual and mystic thought. But what do I make of alchemy? Well, there is a certain lesson I have taken from looking at the history of alchemy and looking at different alchemical manuscripts, but it's not the lesson that you might think. The lesson is this. Someone like myself is fascinated by old manuscripts, whether they come from hundreds or whether they come from thousands of years ago. Old manuscripts are just endlessly fascinating to me, but the reality is that just because a manuscript comes to us from the Middle Ages or from the ancient world, that doesn't mean that it has anything worthwhile to say. It doesn't mean that you're going to learn anything valuable from it. Because such manuscripts do come to us from the Middle Ages or from the ancient world, they have an innate historical value, but in terms of their content, they might have nothing useful to teach you. And that may seem obvious to some of you, but it's not obvious to someone like myself, who is just endlessly fascinated by these older manuscripts, and who I used to have this inbuilt assumption that any old manuscript, just by virtue of being old, just by virtue of having been passed down to us from people hundreds or thousands of years ago, it must have something interesting or perhaps even useful to say. And I've learned through experience that that is simply not the case. Imagine, if you will, a kind of person that you can't stand in the modern day. Imagine a kind of person that you would never listen to, whose advice you would never take under any circumstances whatsoever, and then realize that that kind of person has no doubt existed throughout human history, and that kind of person was just as capable of writing documents as anyone else. Many of these old manuscripts that we have in our possession were clearly written by lunatics, even if they were highly educated lunatics. And so you can spend a very long time translating and trying to understand some obscure document that comes from the Middle Ages or that comes from the ancient world, only to find that you've completely wasted your time in doing so, because it has nothing useful to say, either in terms of the exoteric expression of alchemy or in terms of the esoteric understanding of alchemy. And the reason that I've never talked about alchemy before, which seems like a gross oversight on my part, but the reason I've never talked about alchemy before is that in my study of alchemy, I have never discovered an alchemical document that was expressing any kind of spiritual truth that couldn't also be found elsewhere. And so I don't really see much value in alchemy as far as spiritual insights are concerned. There's no doubt that alchemy, as a precursor to modern day chemistry, there's no doubt that it was absolutely essential. And medieval and ancient alchemists, they suffered many things, including death in many cases, during the course of their experimentation. And yet the lessons we learn from those experiments were absolutely vital in alchemy becoming chemistry, and therefore in contributing something amazing to modern day science as a whole. You know, I don't think any of us would be better off without chemistry as it exists in the modern day, and we do have the sufferings of those medieval and ancient alchemists to thank for that, and to a very large degree. I think that the most obvious distinction between alchemy and chemistry, besides the fact that the latter is a precursor to the former, is simply the fact that, as I said earlier, alchemists would typically have a certain kind of worldview, and usually a spiritual worldview that was made up of all kinds of assumptions that were later proved to be false in material terms. Whereas chemistry, of course, is very much regarded as a secular science. There are no spiritual assumptions underlying the pursuit of chemistry. It is strictly a material science, and I don't think anyone could argue that it has suffered for being so. So I'd love to be wrong on this subject. If some of you, or if any of you have come upon some alchemical document that you do think expresses some kind of spiritual insight that really can't be found elsewhere, then please do let me know, because I'd love to be wrong in not having found any value in alchemy historically as far as its esoteric claims are concerned, but that has just been my experience. I understand that for a lot of people, just like with me, old manuscripts are inherently fascinating, and so if you have a manuscript from an alchemist that lived in the Middle Ages or in the ancient world, it just seems profound because it is an old manuscript. But when you really look past that, when you break through the aura of the manuscript, and you really understand what it's saying and understand what it's trying to put across, whether it's some kind of exoteric claim surrounding material science or some kind of esoteric claim about spiritual truth, when you really get down to it, it's not saying anything that is particularly useful to us in the modern day, either in material or in spiritual terms. Quite often, what these individuals thought is completely wrong, and we know it to be wrong in the modern day. And as far as spiritual insights go, even that which is of value, I just think those kind of insights can be found more easily elsewhere, especially in the sacred texts of the world. But again, I'd love to be proved wrong on that. So if any of you are aware of some alchemical document or alchemical manuscript that you do think is valuable, then please let me know and I'll certainly check it out.